Hi, everybody. This is me again with the Revolutionary War lecture. I'm trying this for about the seventh time, but this one's going to be the charm. Here we go. Here's an outline of the lecture I'm going to do. We're going to start by talking about the type of war it is, the objectives of each side, which is going to be important to understanding why we won, and the fact that it was not a normal type of war of one country against another, but really a civil war in a variety of ways. D and E, I talked about the actual war. The first part of the war is more in the north, and I'm going to argue that's the more important part of the war. And then the second half is the southern part, and then the end. I think it is best to understand the war as similar to one of our later wars. I think it is analogous in many important ways to the Vietnam War. While it is not the exact same war, they share a lot of important similarities, again, helping us to understand why we won. First of all, in the Vietnam War, it was a large military, the American military, against a smaller one, the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese. And we were more advanced, we were better funded, and better equipped. Similarly, in the Revolutionary War, the British were the larger military against our poorly equipped, undermanned, smaller force. But the smaller side in both wars had an advantage. The fact that we fought in our homeland was true for both the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong and for us. The third important analogy or similarity is that the smaller side used untraditional tactics, kind of hit-and-run fighting, that later came to be called guerrilla warfare. While the tactics that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese used are not the same as the tactics we used with George Washington. They're similar in that both were untraditional and looked on in the 1700s and then again in the 1900s as kind of dishonorable and not fair. Similarly, in the Vietnam War, the American side won most of the battles. And in the Revolutionary War, the British won a lot of major battles and probably most of the battles, but not a few big ones. And in the end, winning the battles wasn't enough to win the war. The Americans eventually grew tired of the costly Vietnamese War and the number of soldiers we were losing. And that was why, so we eventually gave up even though we were winning. The similar thing happened in the Revolutionary War. The British side grew tired of the expense of the war and the fact that it was so hard to subdue us and eventually gave up. That makes it a classic war of independence. War objectives. The British and the Americans had very different war objectives, and it is important in understanding why we won. The British were not fighting another country that they simply hoped to conquer. They were fighting their own subjects. And so they were had two purposes that were contradictory. On the one hand, they wanted to put down the rebellion. On the other hand, they wanted to do so without damaging us or making us even more angry. So they tried to win kind of by a few big victories and then convincing us to stop the rebellion. So their objectives were to destroy Washington's Continental Army, capture the congressional leaders who were at the heart of the rebellion, and capture the ports and kind of choke us to death. They wanted to break the rebellion, and at certain points they were happy to offer amnesty for those who gave up the war effort and invite them to rejoin the British side. The Americans, on the other hand, after an initial period, decided that they couldn't really win the war, so they weren't going to try. They were just going to try to avoid the army getting destroyed, the congressional leaders getting captured. They were going to try to win over European allies for help of loans and financing and military help, and that was especially France, and to eventually convince the British that they couldn't win the war, that we would just keep on fighting and fighting, and it was useless to continue to try. Washington's brilliance is that after initially trying to fight a normal traditional war, he figures this out and just tries to preserve the army and wear the British down until they give up. Another important thing to understand about the war is that it was a civil war, and it's true that it was English subjects against English subjects, but I don't just mean that. I don't just mean that it was British versus Americans. Colonists fought on both sides. Those who fought on the side of Britain were called Loyalists, or the nickname was that they were a Tory. Those who fought on the side of the Revolution were Patriots or Whigs. New York and New Jersey especially had a lot of Loyalists or Tories. New York City was very strongly Loyalist. In the South, the fighting between the two sides, the colonists who were Tories and colonists who were Whigs, was especially vicious. If you go to Thatcher Park, you'll see an historical marker that shows a Tory cave where a local Tory who was being harassed and threatened escaped his farm and went up and hid in a cave so that he couldn't be captured, and survived up there for a while before the Patriots saw the smoke from his fires and were able to go capture him. And I forget exactly what happened to him, or I think maybe it doesn't say, but if you go up to Thatcher Park, especially in the fall, now it's very nice, you can find that saved. That's a great little park to visit, by the way. And the final thing I want to point out is the third. I think it was John Adams that said a third of the colonists supported the revolution, a third were loyalists and opposed, and a third were indifferent. And that, I don't know if that is totally accurate, but it is helpful in the sense of seeing that the colonies, all the residents of the colonies were not united in fighting Britain. There was a small committed group that was very loyal to, or wanted the revolution. And there were also some people who'd done pretty well in the colonial times and were loyal to Britain and thought it was wrong of us to just try and break away. And then there were a lot of people who didn't take a strong stance. And when the British Army was in their community, they would happily sell them supplies and food. And when the Continental Army was in the area, they would do the same for them. And so one of Washington's tasks was fighting a war with a population that was mixed in its attitudes about the war, and with a lot of people who were kind of indifferent to the struggle that was taking place. Another way in which it is kind of a civil war is that the African American slaves took both sides. And Washington made it harder on himself when he originally refused to let them join the Continental Army. The British offered the slaves freedom if they joined the Royal Army. 20,000 of them, eventually escaped and joined. And I asked the question, is that very many? And the answer you should get is, yes, that's a lot. Eventually, Washington relented and recruited slaves for the Continental Army. I'm going to have to stop this, and we're going to get through one more slide, and then the bell's going to ring. A third way that this was a kind of civil conflict is that there were Americans in the colonies who were Native Americans, and they had to choose which side they were going to support. In general, most of them chose the British side because it was the colonists who were moving into their hunting grounds and living areas, and the ones that they had conflicts with. And they thought if they allied with the British, that the British would give them more protection from the colonists in the future. An example of this is Joseph Brant, the famous leader of the Iroquois in New York, not far from here to the west in Canajoharie. And he led a number of fights and battles during the Revolutionary War against the colonists. All right, I've got a class starting, so I'm going to stop this there and share it with you.